Welcome to this Click Explains Finance video. This week I'm going to do a recap, since the rules are changing all the time, on a key issue, which is defined benefit pensions. Pensions are in the news the whole time at the moment, concerns as to whether people are saving enough for their retirement. So what I'm going to do is a few videos which will be released over the next few weeks dealing with different aspects of pensions, starting with what are called final salary or defined benefit schemes. Just the basics, no more than that. Email address at the end if you want to know more. So, what's the background here? Basically, final salary, as they're known, schemes used to be commonplace. There was a time when everybody who worked for the state, more or less, the government, got one of these types of pensions, and a lot of people still do, it's fair to say. However, the terms are being changed as time goes by, and many people working for companies looked to their employer to provide this type of pension arrangement, defined benefit or final salary as they're typically known. Now they tend to be only offered by the state, and even the government are looking at ways to cut back on the cost of running these things, and a few employers. If you look at the FTSE 100, it's just a handful of companies that still offer these things, and even fewer that offer them to new employees. You tend to have to have been an employee for a while to even qualify in a lot of cases. And that's because basically they're expensive and unpredictable to run. And companies are increasingly trying to get out of what is quite a sizable obligation, an unpredictable obligation, by making what are called transfer offers. As an employee, if you're offered the opportunity to leave one of these things, you need to look at the terms incredibly carefully, because in a lot of cases, you're not necessarily better off taking the deal. So, quick jargon tour next, for those people unfamiliar with this area. Final salary. Why is it called that? For the simple reason that typically, historically, these schemes tended to pay out an income to you indefinitely in retirement, based on literally your final salaries, your salary in the last year of employment, or maybe an average of the last 2 or 3. Now, these schemes are changing over time. Employers are trying to move away, in a lot of cases, from final salary to average salary to reduce the cost, because if you think about it, most people would expect to be promoted over their career, but final salary is the name given to these things. Defined benefit. Why defined benefit? Well, because typically people in these schemes, and there are some people around who've still got defined benefit schemes, not saying everybody hasn't, but basically in the private sector, if you retired, you'd expect to get an income, defined income, with usually an inflation adjustment on top. So you knew from way back what you could expect to receive in retirement, usually capped at 2/3 in most cases of your final salary. So it wasn't possible to earn, if you like, or accrue more than that, but that's still a sizable chunk. Take your final salary, whatever that number is, 2/3 of it index linked, happy days for most people. And the common principle that underpins these things is that the employee has those guaranteed rights. Now, basic mechanics. How do these work? In essence, an employer and an employee put money in at an agreed or defined rate, if you like. The pension fund, or a pension fund, then invests the money. Okay, equities, bonds, whatever it wants to invest in to try and grow the pot. And at the end of the day, the benefit in retirement is defined, which is good news for the employee. So in essence, if this fund in the middle fails to grow fast enough, that is something that an employer needs to worry about, not an employee. And that's why these schemes are popular with employees, quite rightly so. They're relatively rare now, and they're less popular with the people who've got to fund them, employers. Now, key features. So that's worth taking a quick look at. Basically, the income in retirement, as I mentioned, is guaranteed and usually inflation linked. It's usually linked to a measure of inflation. Under the older schemes, it can be the retail prices index, for example. So not only do you get a fixed benefit in retirement, but it moves up with inflation, so your purchasing power is preserved. There's lump sum withdrawals are permitted from these schemes, and the benefits are normally preserved and deferred for leavers. So you might have worked for, say, 10 years in a company that offered one of these things. You then leave and work for an employer that doesn't. Usually what you can do is just carry forward the frozen benefit, if you like, until the point where you get to the minimum retirement date, or the age at which you can actually draw down those benefits. So usually there is a minimum retirement age. 60 or 65 is common. This is where you need to look at the scheme rules. I wouldn't like to suggest that yours is definitely either one of those ages. Usually a spouse is entitled to a percentage of income, rarely children on top, subject to the scheme rules. What that means is if essentially you die and the pension's up and running, usually a percentage, perhaps 50% for argument's sake, can be paid then in perpetuity to a spouse, your wife for argument's sake. And the pension protection fund is available if a provider goes bust. So there is some compensation backstop, if you like, should a defined benefit provider go bust. Issues. So why are these things fading away, basically? Well, the final liability for the employer is unknown. In other words, the employer is taking a big risk here. They're saying, we guarantee to all our employees that they can get an income based on their final or average salary, and we commit to provide that. Not surprisingly, employers, as people live longer and so on, are trying to back away from that obligation. People are living longer, as I mentioned, and bond yields have plummeted. And what does that mean? Well, it essentially means if you're trying to provide somebody with a fixed income, you might think, logically, I'd invest the money that's got to provide that in fixed income securities. The problem is the yields on those fixed income securities have plummeted. Combination of central banks with their quantitative easing and demand as people seek safe havens for the ones that are left in the market, if that makes sense. And that's making it, to cut a long story short, difficult for employers to fund the obligation that they've promised. Solutions, therefore, if I can call it that, basically some employers are saying, right, we're not going to do, and you may have come across this, we're not going to do final salary anymore. The income you get when you retire, 60, 65, is not based on final salary, it's going to be based on your average salary, the theory being that that will be a lower number and a lower cost for the employer. Reduced accrual rates. So I did mention that the maximum you could get from one of these things was 2/3 of your final salary. So 40/60. So if you work for an employer for 40 years, 40/60 would be 2/3. Well, quite a few employers and the state are bringing that down. They're saying you only accrue an 80th, basically, rather than a 60th. And that means, if you think about it, if you work for 40 years, you can only get to 40/80th, which is half of your average salary, not 2/3 of your final salary. So they're using these methods to sort of cut away at the benefit, if you like. And what some companies are doing is just saying, no, just tinkering won't do. What we'll do is come up with a deal. We'll go to our employees, offer them a lump sum to leave our final salary scheme permanently now. They take that lump sum, do with it what they will, and we're then free of any future obligation. Not surprisingly, those deals are good for the employer. They're not necessarily good for the employee, a topic I'll return to in another video. So to find out more, and there are more videos coming on this topic as we refresh pensions in 2019, it's editor@killick.com. And if you want to watch pensions videos on other aspects of pensions, draw down the 4% rule and so on, then it's killick.com/learn. Have a look down here, and tax effective savings would be a good place to start.